Thomas Walker grabbed the wooden flower off her doorstep chest, heaving jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He'd carved every petal with hands that hadn't trembled in 5 years. And now they were trembling. Because Charlotte Bennett was standing 3 feet away, eyes red from crying, refusing to look away from him. "You left without a word," she said quietly. "I did," he admitted. She stepped closer. "Why did you come back?" Thomas looked at the only woman who had ever made him afraid of himself. "Because I'd rather break in front of you than disappear alone." If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel. Follow along until the very last word and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Colorado Territory, Autumn 1886. Thomas Walker had not always been a man who kept his distance. There was a version of him, a younger version, softer around the edges, quicker to laugh, who used to believe that life was something worth leaning into, that a man could plant something in the ground and watch it grow, that waking up beside someone you loved was not luck. It was something you could earn if you worked hard enough and kept your word and didn't ask for more than you deserved. That version of Thomas was gone. He had buried it 5 years ago on a frozen morning in January when he stood at the edge of a grave and watched them lower Anna Whitmore into the ground, and the minister said something about God's plan, and Thomas had nearly said something back that he would have regretted in front of every person in Silver Creek. He didn't say it. He just turned around and walked away, and kept walking. Not out of town, not away from his obligations. Thomas Walker was not the kind of man who ran from responsibilities. He stayed. He worked. He showed up every morning before the sun and didn't stop until the stars came out. He fixed fences for ranchers who couldn't afford to pay him. He tracked lost cattle in weather that sent younger men back to their mothers. He rebuilt barns and repaired wagon wheels and replanted damaged crops. And he did all of it without being asked twice, without complaining once, without ever letting a single person see that something inside him had gone very, very quiet. People in Silver Creek respected Thomas Walker. They also feared the silence that lived behind his eyes. Not the kind of silence that comes from cruelty. Thomas was never cruel. He was patient in the way that a stone cliff is patient, enduring, immovable, unmoved. When someone brought him a problem, he listened until they finished talking, then solved it with as few words as possible. He remembered what people told him. He remembered their names, their troubles, their anniversaries. He sent food to families when illness struck. He showed up uninvited when a neighbor's barn burned down and stayed until the walls were standing again. But he never once accepted an invitation to supper. He never stayed long enough at any celebration for someone to ask him how he was really doing. Because Thomas already knew the answer, and the answer was not something he wanted to say out loud. The morning Charlotte Bennett arrived in Silver Creek was an ordinary Thursday. Thomas knew it was an ordinary Thursday because he had been patching the back fence of the Harmon property since dawn, and by the time the stagecoach came rolling down the main road, he had already finished half a day's work and was looking forward to nothing more complicated than black coffee and silence. He heard the coach before he saw it. Then he heard the commotion. Silver Creek was not the kind of town where new arrivals created much excitement. Settlers came through regularly, merchants passed through, drifters stopped and moved on. Nobody stared unless there was a reason. But apparently, Charlotte Bennett was a reason. Thomas heard the voices from half a block away, mostly male, mostly young, and entirely too enthusiastic for a Thursday morning. He set down his tools and walked toward the noise out of practical habit, the same way he'd walk toward a fire before anyone asked him to. When he turned the corner, he saw her. She was standing in front of what used to be the old milliner's shop, the one that had sat empty since Widow Crawford moved to Denver the previous winter, and she was directing 2 confused stagecoach workers with the calm confidence of someone who had already decided exactly how this day was going to go. "That trunk goes inside first," she said. "The crates go against the left wall. Please be careful with the long one. There's a sewing machine in it, and I'd rather not spend my first afternoon in Colorado Territory replacing the needle." She had dark hair pinned back with practical efficiency, a traveling coat the color of deep moss, and the kind of posture that told you she hadn't spent her whole life being told what to do, or if she had, she'd decided some time ago to stop listening. Thomas did not stare. He noted what he noticed and looked away. He had learned in 5 years of deliberate solitude how to observe without engaging. It was a useful skill. It kept people from thinking you were interested when you weren't. It kept things clean and uncomplicated. He was halfway back to the Harmon fence when the voice caught him. "Excuse me." He stopped. "The door." She said it without urgency, simply stating a fact. "It doesn't close properly. I tried to push it shut, and it scraped the frame badly enough that I'm worried it'll get worse once the temperature drops." Thomas turned. She was looking directly at him. Not at the space beside him or the general direction of him. Directly at him with brown eyes that were not asking for permission to speak to him. They were simply speaking to him and assuming he'd respond because people generally did. "I can take a look," he said. "Thank you." Her name, he learned in the next few minutes, was Charlotte Bennett. 26 years old. She'd come from St. Louis. She was a dressmaker trained, she said, in a shop that had served half the city's wealthy families, which meant she had watched enough silk and money pass through her hands to know exactly what she wanted when she finally decided to build something of her own. A shop. A real one. Her own. Thomas examined the doorframe in silence. The wood had warped from moisture. Not a difficult fix, but it would take more than a quick adjustment. He'd need to come back with tools. "I can fix it today," he said. "Late afternoon." "What do I owe you?" "Nothing." She looked at him then with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something more like careful attention, the look of a person who was deciding whether to believe you. "I don't accept charity," she said. "I'd rather pay fair wages." "Then pay me what you think it's worth when it's done," he said. He walked away before she could answer. He came back at 4 o'clock with his tools. She was inside organizing bolts of fabric and didn't look up when he came through. He worked quietly. He liked working quietly. The problem was exactly what he'd thought: moisture damage compounded by years of the frame settling unevenly. He shaved the edges, replaned the contact points, reinforced the hinge placement with longer screws, and tested the swing 3 times before he was satisfied. When he finished, the door opened and closed without a whisper of resistance. Charlotte had been watching for the last few minutes without him noticing, or rather, without him acknowledging that he'd noticed. "You build things like you want them to last forever," she said. He picked up his tools. "That's the point." She tilted her head slightly. "Most men around here seem to build things they plan to fix again next season. That's because most men charge by the hour." A small smile. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out 2 coins, setting them on the edge of the doorframe. He looked at the coins, then looked at her. "That's generous?" "That's fair," she said simply. "There's a difference." Thomas pocketed the coins and left. But the exchange stayed with him through supper and into the evening, which was unusual. Conversations rarely stayed with him anymore. He'd trained himself to process what was necessary and let the rest drift away. Charlotte Bennett apparently did not drift. The first real test came 9 days later. Thomas heard it from across the street, raised voices outside Charlotte's shop. The particular kind of raised voices that meant someone was pressing an advantage and someone else was being pressed. He crossed without thinking. Inside a man named Gerald Poole, he ran a dry goods store 2 doors down and had the disposition of someone who'd never been told no by anyone he didn't have to listen to, was standing very close to Charlotte's counter, with his hat in his hand and his chin out, and his voice at a volume that was meant to convince. "I'm telling you, it's a fair offer," Poole was saying. "The lease on this property is worth half what you're paying. I know the owner. I can arrange better terms. All I'm asking is that you think about it before you go spending money on repairs." Charlotte was folding fabric with the precise focus of someone who had decided that the most powerful thing she could do right now was refuse to stop working. "I've already thought about it," she said pleasantly. "The answer is no." "Now see, Mr. Poole." Still pleasant, still folding. "I am a dressmaker. I am not inexperienced with negotiation. And I am not interested in arrangements where the other party knows my landlord personally and comes to me before the first month is even over." Poole noticed Thomas in the doorway. His chin went down about 2 inches. "Walker." "Poole." Thomas looked at Charlotte. "Everything's settled here." "Completely," she said. Then looked at Poole with the same expression she'd given the stagecoach workers on the first day, calm, clear, entirely finished with the conversation. Poole left. Thomas stood in the doorway for a moment. "He'll come back," he said. "I know." She set the fabric down. "He'll come back until he finds someone else to pressure, or until he realizes I'm not going to stop being here." She looked at Thomas steadily. "I'm not going anywhere." He believed her. That was the part that surprised him. Tag. The Silver Creek Harvest Festival was held on the second Saturday of October, as it had been for as long as anyone could remember. Thomas attended every year because some things in a small town weren't optional. You showed up because people expected you to, because your absence created more conversation than your presence, and because even a man determined to remain solitary understood the social math of small community survival. He arrived late. He stayed near the edges. He accepted a cup of cider from the Harmon boys and shook hands with the men who wanted to talk about the coming winter, and he nodded at the women who nodded first, and he mostly watched the way a man watches something he has no intention of touching. Charlotte was easy to find in the crowd, not because she was loud or dramatic. She was neither. But there was something about the way she moved through a gathering, unhurried, genuinely interested, present in the way that most people weren't, that drew the eye without demanding it. She had 3 young men orbiting her near the cider table. Thomas recognized all of them. Good enough boys, eager, the kind of young men who confused enthusiasm with appeal. They were all talking at once, each trying to be the one she looked at longest. Charlotte was looking at each of them equally, listening, laughing at the right moments, never making any of them feel dismissed. Thomas watched. He recognized the pattern because he had once been in the crowd himself, not chasing exactly, but believing that being in proximity to something good was the same as deserving it. He had been wrong about that. He turned away, but her voice reached him before he could move. "You've been watching from the edge of this party for 2 hours, she said. She was beside him now, cup of cider in one hand. The 3 young men had apparently been redistributed to the wider crowd. "It's warmer near the fire." "I don't mind the cold." "I know you don't." A pause. "That's what worries me about you." He looked at her then. Something about the directness of it, not aggressive, not pitying, just simply honest, made it impossible not to look. "You don't need to worry about me," he said. "I'm not doing it on purpose," she replied. "It just happens when I notice someone who's working very hard not to be noticed." Thomas was quiet for a moment. And then, because he had not said an honest thing to another person in longer than he cared to calculate, he said something close to one. "You're going to break a lot of hearts." He said it the way you say something you've been turning over in your mind, not as a compliment, not as a warning, but as the simple truth of what you're looking at. Being the way you are, in a town like this, you're going to break a lot of hearts. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. The music from across the square drifted toward them. Fiddle. The kind of fiddle playing that belongs outdoors at night. And then Charlotte looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen directed at himself in 5 years. Something careful and warm and absolutely certain, and she said very quietly, "I only want to mend yours." Thomas didn't respond. He couldn't. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because the words had landed somewhere inside him that he had not opened in so long he'd almost forgotten it was there. He walked away. He walked home. He sat in his cabin in the dark for a long time, and he did not think about tomorrow's fence work. He did not think about the Harmon property, or the Colby cattle, or the coming winter. He thought about the look on her face when she said it. Like she meant it, and it wasn't complicated. Like she already knew something about him that he hadn't told her. Like she was willing to wait. The next 3 weeks were some of the strangest of Thomas's adult life. Charlotte began stopping by his workshop, not every day, not with the frequency of someone pursuing a deliberate strategy, but often enough that he started noticing when she wasn't there. The first time she said she needed advice about the back door of her shop, same building, different problem, a hinge that had loosened. He told her she could fix it herself with a screwdriver and a half-inch screw. She wrote it down and thanked him and left, which was not what he expected. The second time she brought him a piece of apple cake and said her neighbor Mrs. Patterson had made 3 cakes for a church supper and had extras, and she thought he might want some, which was so plainly offered without expectation that he couldn't find a polite reason to refuse. The third time she sat down on the workbench beside a half-finished cabinet and said, "Tell me what you're building." He told her. Then she asked about the wood. He told her that too. Then she asked where he'd learned carpentry, and he said from his father, and from necessity, and she said she'd learned dressmaking from her mother, and from necessity as well, and something about the parallel of it made the conversation continue for another 40 minutes without him planning for it to. She asked about the ranches he'd worked, the territories he'd traveled through, the kinds of landscapes that stayed with you. Nobody asked Thomas about those things. Not anymore. He answered carefully at first, one sentence at a time, waiting out of old habit for the interest to be surface level, for the questions to run dry, for the conversation to shift toward her story, her needs, her purpose in sitting down. But Charlotte didn't do that. She waited when he paused. She didn't rush to fill the silence. And slowly, the way ice thaws not all at once, but in increments you can't quite point to, Thomas began to say more than he planned. He told her about working the Kearney Ranch before he came to Silver Creek, about the horses there, and about one mare in particular, who had been so spooked by a lightning strike that she wouldn't take a rider for 2 years, and how Thomas had spent 6 months gaining her trust with nothing but patience and consistency. Until the morning she walked up to him and put her head against his chest. Charlotte listened to the whole thing. Then she said, "That's the most you've said to me at once." He realized she was right. "I used to talk more," he said. Then stopped. She didn't push, but he finished the thought anyway. Before. One word. Enough. Charlotte nodded. She didn't ask before what. She didn't try to construct a sentence around the gap he'd left. She just nodded the way someone nods when they understand that some things are named by what surrounds them rather than what's said directly. That was the day Thomas decided Charlotte Bennett was the most unusual person he had met in 5 years. He didn't know whether to be grateful for that or afraid of it. He was both. In the second week of November, Thomas overheard something he wasn't meant to hear. He was inside the hardware store when 2 men came in behind him, a rancher named Caulfield and his son, neither of whom had strong opinions about keeping their voices down. "The Bennett woman's shop," Caulfield said. "She know the lease renewal's in question." "Doubt it," the son said. "Henderson's talking to Poole about consolidating the East Side properties. If they get the Milliner building and the apothecary corner both, they can put up a proper freight depot." "She sign anything yet?" "Contracts month to month, legal enough. But Henderson wants those buildings by spring." Thomas set down the hinges he'd been examining. He did not turn around. He paid for what he needed and left. He stood outside for a long moment in the November cold thinking. He could tell Charlotte. He could say nothing. He could keep his distances clean and his obligations uncomplicated and remind himself that Charlotte Bennett was a grown woman who had navigated St. Louis and a stagecoach and Gerald Poole without assistance, and she would handle this too. He went and told Charlotte. She was behind her counter when he came in. She looked up without surprise. She'd stopped looking surprised when he appeared, which was either a good sign or a dangerous one. He told her what he'd heard. He told her without softening it. Caulfield, Henderson, Pool. The freight depot plans. Month-to-month lease. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How long do I have?" "If they move fast, 2 months. If they don't, maybe until March. That's not much time." "No." Another silence. And then Charlotte looked at him with something he hadn't expected. Not panic, not tears, but the same expression she'd had when she told Gerald Poole the answer was no. Quiet. Settled. Already moving to the next thing. "I need to find out who owns the building outright," she said, "before Henderson approaches them directly. If I can speak to the owner first." "Widow Morrison," Thomas said. "She's in Denver. I can get you an address by tomorrow." Charlotte looked at him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "Thomas?" she said finally. "Yes." "Why are you doing this?" The question landed in the middle of the room like something physical. Thomas picked up his hat, which he'd taken off when he came in, and turned it once in his hands. "Because you've been building something," he said carefully, "and I don't like watching someone's foundation get pulled out from under them." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was a piece of it. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. "That's a practical answer," she said softly. "I'm a practical man." She smiled, just barely. "No," she said. "You're not." And she was right, and they both knew it, and Thomas left before the conversation could prove it any further. Tia. He got the address. Charlotte wrote to Widow Morrison the same night. The response came back in 10 days faster than expected, written in a cramped, direct hand that reminded Thomas of Charlotte herself. She came to his workshop to read it to him. She didn't have to do that. She could have handled it alone. She had been handling things alone since before she arrived in Silver Creek. But she came to his workshop. "Mrs. Morrison," she read, "says she has no intention of selling the building to a freight company. She says the east side of Silver Creek already smells like horses, and she doesn't need it to smell like cargo, too. She says if I want a 2-year lease at a fixed rate, she'll have her lawyer draw it up." Thomas set down his chisel. "Good," he said. Charlotte looked up from the letter. She was smiling a real smile, the kind that happened before you decided whether or not to let it. And for a moment the workshop was full of something Thomas had no name for, only the physical sensation of it, which was a warmth somewhere behind his sternum that he did not trust and could not dismiss. "Good," he said again, more quietly. Charlotte folded the letter. "Thank you," she said, "for the address, for telling me. It was the right thing to do. Lots of people know what the right thing is," she said. "Not everyone does it." She left. Thomas stood at his workbench for a long time without picking anything up. He was aware in the way that a man is aware of a crack forming in a wall he's been leaning against, that something was changing. That the careful arrangement of his solitary life, well-ordered, predictable, protected, was developing weak points, and that the weak points all had the same shape. The first week of December brought the first snow. Charlotte came to his workshop that evening with her coat still dusted white and her nose red from the cold, and she sat down on the stool beside his workbench and said without preamble, "Tell me about Anna." The room went very still. Thomas did not move. He had heard her name spoken maybe a dozen times in 5 years, usually by people who brought it up carefully, apologetically, as if they were setting down something fragile. Nobody had ever simply said it the way Charlotte said it, directly, without ceremony, without a face that anticipated pain in return. "Why?" he said flatly. "Because you've told me about the Kearney Ranch, and the Colby cattle, and the way the mountains look in September when the light changes," Charlotte said, "and I'd like to know the rest of who you are." Thomas set down his tools. He walked to the window. Outside the snow was falling straight down. No wind, which meant it would be deep by morning. She was kind, he said finally. Quiet. She laughed at things that weren't funny to anyone else, and she didn't care if that seemed strange. A pause. She knew how to be still. I didn't back then. I was always moving. She used to say I'd wear myself out before I turned 30. He stopped. She wasn't wrong. Charlotte said nothing. He kept going. She got sick in December. We thought it was a winter cold. It wasn't. He paused. By January, she was gone. One more pause. I had been going to ask her to marry me in the spring. The snow kept falling. Charlotte said quietly, I'm sorry. It was 5 years ago. 5 years doesn't make it not hurt. Thomas turned from the window. Charlotte was looking at him the way she always looked at him, directly, steadily, without pity, but with something that was not pity and was harder to refuse. No, he said, it doesn't. And something about saying it out loud, simply, without deflection. Something about having a person in the room who had asked without flinching and was listening without trying to fix it, cracked something open in Thomas Walker's chest that had been sealed shut for 5 years. He didn't cry. He wasn't built that way anymore, if he ever had been. But he felt it. The crack, the air coming through, and it terrified him. Because he knew, he had known since the night of the Harvest Festival, maybe before, that if he let Charlotte Bennett get any closer, he was going to want things he'd given up wanting. And wanting things meant risking losing them. And Thomas Walker was not sure even now, even 5 years later, that he had enough of himself left to survive another loss. So he made a decision. The wrong one. But he made it. He was going to walk away before she could become something he could not afford to lose. He just didn't know yet that it was already too late for that. The decision Thomas made that night should have been simple. He had made hard decisions before. He had walked away from good wages when the work crossed a line he wouldn't cross. He had turned down offers that would have made him a wealthy man because they required him to be someone he wasn't. He had buried the woman he loved and kept breathing afterward, which was the hardest decision of all, and he had survived it by narrowing his life down to what was manageable. Charlotte Bennett was not manageable, and that was the problem. He told himself it was for her benefit. That was the version he ran through his mind on the walk home that night, the snow crunching under his boots, the cold clean and simple, in a way that nothing inside him was. She was young. She had a business to build. She needed to be surrounded by people who had futures they believed in, not a man who had spent 5 years convincing himself that survival and living were the same thing. He told himself all of it, and he almost believed it. He didn't go to the workshop the next day. He had work. He always had work, but he arranged it so that none of it took him past Charlotte's shop, past his own workshop where she had been sitting on that stool the night before, past any of the geography that had quietly, without his permission, become geography that meant something. He went to the Colby Ranch and spent the day reinforcing the western fence line. Physical work, cold air, the kind of labor that demanded enough attention to crowd out everything else. It worked until it didn't. By mid-afternoon, Frank Colby came out with coffee and leaned against the post beside him and said without any particular lead-up, "Heard you've been spending time at the new dressmaker's shop." Thomas drove a post into the frozen ground without looking up. "I fixed her door." "Uh-huh." Frank drank his coffee. "And brought her Widow Morrison's address, and warned her about Henderson's plans." Thomas straightened and looked at him. Frank was a decent man with an honest face and the mild, interested expression of someone who was not going to pretend he hadn't noticed something. "Not criticizing," he said. "Just observing." "Then observe quieter." Frank smiled into his coffee. "She seems like good people." "She is. Town could use that." "I know it." Frank waited. Thomas picked up the next post. "It's not what you're thinking," Thomas said. "I'm not thinking anything," Frank said. "I'm just standing here with coffee." Thomas said nothing. "She asked about you," Frank said. "When she came by to look at a bolt of canvas she needed for her shop curtains. Asked if you were all right. Said she hadn't seen you in 2 days and you hadn't answered the knock at your workshop." Thomas stopped. She had knocked at his workshop. He hadn't heard it, or he had been far enough back in the timber yard that the sound hadn't reached him, but the fact of it landed differently than he expected. Not as something to be managed. as something that made his chest ache in a way he didn't have vocabulary for anymore. "She'll be fine," he said. Frank set his cup down on the fence post. "Thomas." His voice had changed slightly, quieter. "I knew you before. I knew you and Anna both." A pause. "I'm not asking you to replace anything. Neither is she from what I can see. I'm just saying a man can build fences all his life and still end up on the wrong side of the one that matters most." Thomas looked at him. Frank picked up his cup and walked back toward the house. Thomas stood in the cold for a long time, hands on the post, not driving it down. He went to the workshop that evening. He told himself he was going to get tools he needed for the Harmon property. That was true. He did need tools. But he also went because Frank's words had dislodged something he couldn't put back, and because a part of him, the part he'd been arguing with for weeks, wanted to know if she had really knocked. Charlotte was not there, which was fine. He hadn't expected her. He hadn't wanted her to be. He was pulling the tools he needed off the wall when he found it. It was tucked between two boards on the workbench, small enough that he would have missed it if he hadn't reached for the planer at exactly that angle. A folded piece of paper. He opened it. The handwriting was clean and unhurried. "I don't know why you've gone quiet. Maybe I said something wrong. If I did, I'd rather you tell me than disappear because I think you're someone worth the discomfort of an honest conversation. But if you need the space, then take it. I won't keep knocking." C. Thomas read it twice. Then he sat down on the stool where she usually sat. The note sat in his hands, and he didn't move for a long time. "I think you're someone worth the discomfort of an honest conversation." Nobody had said anything like that to him in 5 years. Nobody had said it because he'd never given anyone the opportunity. He had kept himself so far back from the possibility of being known that there was no one close enough to say it. Charlotte had managed it anyway. He folded the note and put it in his coat pocket. And then he sat in his own workshop in the dark and had the most honest argument with himself he'd had in years. On one side of it, everything he'd built. The quiet. The control. The absence of anticipation, which meant the absence of disappointment. The life that asked nothing of him and gave him just enough to stay standing. On the other side, the way she said his name. The way she listened when he talked about the mayor at Kearney Ranch. The way she had read him the letter from Widow Morrison with a real smile on her face and come to his workshop to do it, and hadn't needed to, but had anyway. He knew which side was winning. He knew it, and it terrified him. He put the tools back on the wall and went home without them. He went to see her the next morning. It was earlier than a social visit had any business being, and she was already behind her counter with her reading glasses on, going through what looked like a ledger. The shop was beginning to take on the feeling of a real place. Fabric sorted and labeled. A dress form in the corner with a half-finished gown pinned to it. The curtains she'd mentioned to Frank Colby now hung, making the space warmer and more deliberate. She looked up when he came in. She didn't say anything. She waited. That was something he'd noticed about her early on, and kept noticing Charlotte was not afraid of silence. She didn't fill it. She didn't perform patience. She simply existed in it until the other person was ready, which was both easier and harder than being rushed. "I got your note," Thomas said. "I assumed you would. You said you wouldn't keep knocking. I left a note instead. That's not the same thing." A pause. "I also said I wouldn't apologize if I hadn't done anything wrong. So I'm not going to. I'm not asking you to." She took off her reading glasses. "Then why are you here?" He stood there in the middle of her shop with his hat in his hand and the answer in his mouth, and the answer was too large and too complicated and too honest for 8 in the morning, so he did what he was capable of doing instead. "I want to finish what I was saying the other night," he said. "About Anna." Charlotte was quiet. "I stopped because I got afraid," he said. "Not of you, of what the talking was doing." He paused. "Every time I tell you something real, you listen to it like it matters. And I stopped knowing what to do with that." Charlotte was silent for a long moment. Then she set her glasses down and said carefully, "Does it make you want to stop talking? Or does it make you want to say more?" The question hit him somewhere in the center of the chest. "Both," he said honestly. She nodded slowly. "I can work with both," she said. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. December settled into Silver Creek like a hand pressing down. Cold, heavy, the kind of winter that made people either draw together or burrow deeper alone. Thomas drew toward Charlotte, not dramatically, not with declarations or gestures, with the quiet accumulation of small things that added up to something neither of them was ready to name directly. He came by her shop 2 or 3 evenings a week. She came by his workshop on the days she had questions about the shelving she wanted built into the back room, and then on days when she didn't have questions, and then on days when neither of them pretended there was a practical reason. They talked. That was the thing that kept blindsiding Thomas. Not the proximity, not even the warmth of it, but the talking. He had not truly talked about things that were real and sometimes uncomfortable in so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have a mind responding to his own in real time. Charlotte had opinions. She argued when she disagreed, not loudly, but precisely finding the exact place where she thought he was wrong and staying there until he'd examined it properly. She had read more than most people he knew and was unembarrassed about it. She asked questions that surprised him. One evening she asked, "What would you have built if you'd had the time and the money and no obligations to anyone?" He didn't answer right away. "A house," he said finally. "Not a ranch, just a house, with a porch wide enough to be worth sitting on, big windows, a garden." "What kind of garden?" "The kind that serves no practical purpose," he said, and then was surprised to hear himself say it, because he hadn't known that was his answer until it left his mouth. Charlotte smiled at her fabric. "I like that," she said. "Everything practical all the time is exhausting." He looked at her. "You seem like someone who's always been practical," he said. "The business, the negotiating, the lease." "I am practical," she said. "I had to be. My mother spent her whole life being told that women who wanted things for themselves were selfish, and she believed it, and she was unhappy until she died." A pause. "I decided I would be practical enough to get myself to the place where I could afford to want things." "And are you there?" She looked up. The shop was quiet around them. Outside the window, the snow was at it again. "Getting there," she said. Quietly. And the way she said it, looking at him when she said it, made Thomas look away. Because he was getting somewhere too, and he was not entirely sure it was safe. The crisis arrived without warning on a Tuesday. Thomas was at the hardware store when Henry Walsh came in, fast coat half-buttoned, the look on his face that people got when something had gone from bad to worse in a short amount of time. "It's the Bennett woman," Walsh said, not to Thomas specifically, just to the room. "Henderson's lawyer just walked into her shop with papers. Some argument about the original lease agreement, says there's a clause that lets the property holder renegotiate if the tenant makes improvements over a certain value without written permission." Thomas was already putting down what he was holding. "She put in shelving last week," Walsh continued. "Built in. The lawyer's saying that counts as a structural improvement and triggers the clause. Henderson wants her out by the 1st of the month. The 1st of the month was 18 days away. Thomas walked out of the hardware store without his purchases and covered the 2 blocks to Charlotte's shop at a pace that was not quite running, but was close enough that 2 people turned to look. When he came through the door, Charlotte was standing on her side of the counter. On the other side was a thin man in a dark coat with a leather case, and the particular expression of someone who had delivered bad news enough times to have stopped feeling it. A folded set of papers sat on the counter between them. Charlotte was not crying. Charlotte was not panicking. Charlotte was standing with her hands flat on the counter, and her jaw set, and her eyes doing the thing they did when she was thinking, fast-moving, slightly tracking something internal. "Thomas," she said without surprise. The lawyer looked at him. "Is there a problem?" the lawyer said. That depends on what those papers say, Thomas replied. They're legal documents. The property holder is within his rights. Let me see them. They're addressed to Miss Bennett, Charlotte. Thomas looked at her. Do you want me to look at them? Please, she said. He read through them at the counter. The lawyer waited with the patience of a man who had decided that patience was professionally advantageous in situations where the other party was looking for a reason to be angry. Thomas read carefully, then read certain sections again. When he finished, he set the papers down. The shelf unit I built is freestanding, he said. It's secured to the wall with 2 brackets for stability, but it can be removed without damage to the structure. That's not a permanent improvement. That's furniture. The lawyer's expression tightened slightly. The clause specifies any modification that... The clause specifies permanent structural modification. Read your own document. Thomas put his finger on the relevant paragraph. Freestanding furniture is not a structural modification under any standard interpretation of that language, and your client knows it, which is why he sent you here instead of filing with the county court. A silence. Furthermore, Thomas continued, if Henderson attempts to claim it is, Charlotte has a 2-year lease at a fixed rate that was executed before his involvement in the property was ever a factor. Widow Morrison signed it. It's filed with the county recorder. He looked up. Tell your client to try something else. The lawyer picked up his case. He left the papers on the counter. Those are for your records, he said to Charlotte without looking at Thomas. And then he was gone. Charlotte let out a long, slow breath. Thomas watched her. You knew about the lease filing, she said. I went with you to file it. I was the one who said you needed to file it. You remembered exactly what it said. I remember things. She was looking at him across the counter with an expression he couldn't read entirely. Relief, yes, and something else underneath it, something quieter and more complicated. Thomas, she said. It's fine. He won't come back. That's not what I was going to say. He waited. I was going to say... She stopped, started again. I keep finding out that you've been paying attention to things I didn't ask you to pay attention to. Things I didn't even know I needed someone to pay attention to. He picked up his hat. Charlotte, I'm not asking you for anything, she said quickly. I know you need that to be clear. I'm not asking. I'm just... She exhaled. Saying thank you doesn't feel like enough, and I don't know what the right word is. Thomas stood there. He knew what the right word was. He had known it for weeks. He was not going to say it. You don't need a word, he said instead. Just keep building your business. He left before she could answer. But outside in the cold, he stopped. He stood on the street in the December air with his hat in his hand, and his chest doing something that he hadn't given it permission to do, and he thought about the way she'd looked at him across that counter, and the way she'd said, I keep finding out, like it was something she was discovering in real time and couldn't decide whether to trust. He knew exactly how that felt. He walked home. He did not feel better for having left. 2 days after the lawyer's visit, a stranger came to Silver Creek. His name was Daniel Marsh, and he arrived on the Tuesday afternoon stage from Denver with 2 bags and the kind of easy confidence that came from being accustomed to a certain effect on rooms when he entered them. He was perhaps 30, well-dressed for the frontier, with dark hair and a way of looking at people that communicated interest without effort. Thomas wouldn't have thought about him twice except for where Daniel Marsh went first. He went to Charlotte's shop. Thomas found out the way he found out most things in Silver Creek, not by asking, but by existing in a small town long enough that information found its way to him through the natural channels of people who talked. Mrs. Patterson mentioned it to Frank Colby's wife, who mentioned it to Frank, who mentioned it to Thomas, with the elaborate casualness of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Old family friend, apparently, Frank said. Came up from Denver. She seemed happy to see him. Thomas said nothing. Good-looking fellow, Frank added. Thomas picked up his tools. Don't, he said. I'm just providing information. Provide it to someone who asked for it. Frank smiled the smile of a man who had made his point and was content to let it sit. Thomas went home and made supper and ate it and cleaned the dishes and told himself that Daniel Marsh from Denver was not his concern, and that Charlotte Bennett's life was Charlotte Bennett's business, and that he had made a decision weeks ago, and the decision still made sense and nothing had changed. He told himself all of it. He did not sleep well. He saw them the following afternoon. He wasn't looking for them. He was coming out of the feed store with a bag over his shoulder when he heard her laugh. Her real laugh, the one that happened before she decided to let it, and he turned toward it without thinking. Charlotte and Daniel Marsh were standing outside the general store. She was showing him something in the shop window. He was listening with his whole body turned toward her the way men turned toward Charlotte when they were paying full attention, which in Thomas's experience was approximately every man who spent more than 5 minutes with her. Thomas kept walking. He kept walking, and he did not look back, and he went to the Harmon property and worked until his shoulders ached and the light was gone. That night, Charlotte knocked at his workshop. He heard it this time. He opened the door. She came in without being invited, which she had stopped waiting to do sometime in November, and she sat on her stool and looked at him with the direct gaze that still even now didn't give him anywhere to hide. "Daniel Marsh is an old friend," she said. "From St. Louis. He's in Colorado for a land survey job. He came by to say hello." Thomas turned back to his workbench. "You don't have to explain your visitors to me." "I know I don't have to." "Then why?" "Because you looked like you'd been hit when you walked past us today," she said. "And you think I didn't notice, but I did. And I'd rather have an honest conversation about it than let you disappear into your workshop for another 2 days." Thomas kept his hands on the workbench. "It's not my business who visits your shop," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." A pause. "But it bothered you." He didn't answer. "Thomas." Her voice was quiet. Not pushing. Just there. "I know this is hard for you. I know you didn't ask for any of this. I know you built a life that was supposed to keep you from feeling exactly what you're feeling right now." Another pause. "But I need you to know that I see the difference between what's easy and what's real. Daniel Marsh is easy. He's familiar and uncomplicated, and he's never going to make me feel the way." She stopped. The workshop went very still. Thomas turned around. Charlotte was looking at him with an expression that was doing something he'd never seen it do before, something uncertain. Something that had pushed closer to the edge than she'd planned, and was deciding right now in real time whether to step back or keep going. She kept going. "He's never going to make me feel the way you do," she said. "When you walk into a room, when you remember things I didn't know you were keeping track of, when you went to that lawyer with the lease details that you had memorized without me ever asking you to." Her voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. "I'm not asking you to fix anything or decide anything tonight. I just need you to know that what's happening here, whatever it is not nothing. And I think you know it isn't nothing." Thomas looked at her. The workshop was completely quiet. And then he said the most honest thing he had said in 5 years. "I know it isn't nothing." His voice was rough. "That's what I'm afraid of." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright, but she didn't look away. "I know," she said. "I'm afraid of it too." And the two of them stood in the quiet workshop in December in Colorado. Neither of them moving, neither of them looking away on the edge of something large and terrifying and real. Thomas did not reach for her. He was not ready. But he also did not leave. And for the first time in 5 years, not leaving felt like the bravest thing he had ever done. Not leaving felt like the bravest thing he had ever done. But bravery, Thomas had learned, was not the same as readiness. He went home that night and lay in the dark and thought about what Charlotte had said. What's happening here? Whatever it is not nothing. He turned the words over, the way he turned a piece of wood over, before cutting it, looking for the grain, looking for where the pressure would hold and where it would split. She was right. It was not nothing. It had not been nothing since the night of the Harvest Festival. Maybe before that. Maybe since the first afternoon he'd planed her doorframe, and she'd said, "You build things like you want them to last forever." And he'd walked away thinking about it for 3 hours without meaning to. The question was not whether it was something. The question was whether Thomas Walker, at 34 years old, with 5 years of deliberate solitude, and a grief he'd never fully spoken out loud, was capable of being someone worth the risk Charlotte would be taking. He didn't know the answer, and not knowing was its own kind of agony. He was at the workshop by first light. He worked on a cabinet commission for the Harmon family, his hands going through the familiar motions while his mind did something less organized. He was 3 hours in when the door opened, and he turned, already expecting her, already recalibrated, without deciding to be to a world where Charlotte Bennett knocked at his door in the morning. It was not Charlotte. It was Daniel Marsh. Thomas set down his plane slowly. Marsh came in without being invited, which landed differently from when Charlotte did it, and looked around the workshop with the easy curiosity of a man who had never been told he wasn't welcome somewhere. "Nice setup," Marsh said. "What do you need?" Marsh looked at him with the mild expression of a man who had registered the lack of welcome and decided to be amused by it rather than bothered. "Nothing from you specifically. I came to say something." Thomas waited. "I've known Charlotte Bennett for 6 years, Marsh said. "I knew her in St. Louis when she was working 14-hour days at the Morrison shop, saving every cent she made. I knew her when her mother died, and she didn't take a single day off work because stopping meant she'd have to feel it." He paused. "I came out here because she wrote me a letter. First letter she'd sent me in 8 months, and most of it was about Silver Creek and the shop and the lease situation. She handled the lease situation." "She mentioned that too." Marsh looked at him steadily. "About a third of the letter was about you." Thomas said nothing. "I'm not here to compete with you," Marsh said. "I want to be clear about that. Charlotte is the kind of person who makes everyone around her want to be better, and I'm not naive enough to think that means I'm the right person for her just because I've known her longest." He picked up a piece of scrap wood from the workbench and turned it in his hands. "But I am here to tell you that she has spent the last 6 years building something out of nothing alone, without anyone in her corner in any real way. And if you're in her corner, then be in it. And if you're not ready to be in it, tell her so she can stop rearranging her life around the possibility." He set the wood down. "That's all," he said, and left. Thomas stood at the workbench with his hands flat on the surface and his jaw clenched and something happening in his chest that he couldn't entirely classify. He picked up his plane. He set it back down. He picked up his coat instead. He found Charlotte at the shop, which was where she always was, because Charlotte was always working. She was fitting a dress on the mannequin form with pins between her lips and her reading glasses on, and the focused inward expression she got when her hands were doing something precise. She saw him in the reflection of the window glass. She took the pins out of her mouth. "Marsh came to see me," Thomas said. Charlotte turned around slowly. "I didn't ask him to." "I know." He paused. "He said you wrote him a letter, that about a third of it was about me." She looked at him. Something moved across her face, not quite embarrassment, but the expression of a person who has been more honest in writing than they intended to be in person. "He wasn't supposed to say that, Charlotte." Thomas crossed the shop until he was standing close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." "I always answer honestly." "I know you do. That's why I'm asking." He exhaled. "What do you want from me?" She was quiet for a moment. "That's a big question," she said. "I know it is." She took her glasses off, set them on the counter beside her, and then she looked at him with those brown eyes that had never once looked at him with anything less than full attention. "I want you to stop treating yourself like a man who already used up his one chance," she said. "I want you to stop deciding in advance what you don't deserve. I want you to let me sit in your workshop sometimes without it meaning something catastrophic." A pause. "And I'd like it very much if you stopped walking past me on the street like you're trying to outpace your own feelings." Thomas looked at her. "That's not a small list," he said. "No," she agreed. "But none of it requires you to promise me anything. It just requires you to stop running from what's already there." The shop was quiet. Outside, Silver Creek was doing its ordinary things. Horses' voices, the distant sound of the blacksmith at work. "I'm afraid," Thomas said. Just that. No elaboration, no justification. Charlotte stepped closer, close enough that if either of them moved, it would mean something. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you not to be afraid. I'm asking you to be afraid and stay anyway." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something he had not done in 5 years. He reached out and took her hand. Not with urgency, not with drama. He just took her hand in both of his, the way you hold something you're finally willing to admit you've been wanting to pick up for a very long time. Charlotte went still. "I'm staying," he said quietly. "I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'm staying." Her hand tightened around his. "That's enough," she said. "That's all I needed to know." January arrived like a reckoning. The winter in Colorado Territory that year was not the gentle, photogenic kind. It was the kind that tested the construction of everything buildings, bridges resolve. Thomas spent the first week of it reinforcing structures across Silver Creek that were not up to the weather, and Charlotte spent it learning that a dressmaking shop in a frontier winter required more practical management than she had been trained for in St. Louis. They met in the evenings, sometimes at his workshop, sometimes at the small table in the back of her shop where she kept a pot of coffee that was consistently stronger than necessary. They talked about the day's work. They argued sometimes about practical things, about ideas, about the right way to approach a problem with the particular energy of two people who respected each other enough to disagree without fear of consequence. Thomas fixed things in the shop that needed fixing, not because she asked, but because he saw what needed doing. Charlotte started leaving supper at his workshop door on the nights he worked late. Not every night, just often enough. Nobody said anything directly, but Silver Creek was a small town, and small towns did not require announcements. Mrs. Patterson began referring to Charlotte as Thomas's Charlotte in conversations with the breezy certainty of a woman who had decided this was a fact and was simply helping the world catch up to it. Frank Colby shook Thomas's hand one afternoon for no apparent reason. Thomas told him to stop. Frank shook it again. It should have felt like something closing in. It didn't. It felt in a way Thomas hadn't felt anything in years, like something opening. The second week of January was when everything changed. Thomas found out about it from the county recorder's office, which he had been checking quietly since the fall, a habit born of the Henderson situation, which had made him cautious about what was being filed and by whom. What he found stopped him cold in the middle of the office. Henderson had filed a quiet title claim against the Morrison property. A quiet title claim was a legal action that could, under certain circumstances, challenge the validity of an existing lease, not by attacking the lease itself, but by contesting the original ownership chain that authorized it. It was complicated. It was slow. And it was the kind of legal maneuvering that required money and patience, and the conviction that the other party wouldn't have the resources to fight it properly. Thomas stood at the records counter and read through the filing twice. Then he went to find the one person in Silver Creek who would understand exactly how serious this was. His name was Robert Kellen. He had practiced law in Denver for 20 years before his wife decided she was done with cities, and Robert, who loved his wife considerably more than he loved Denver, had followed her to Silver Creek and maintained a small practice that mostly handled land disputes and the occasional complicated estate. Thomas knocked on his door at 7:30 in the morning, which was not a polite hour for a visit, and Kellen answered it in suspenders and a look of mild exasperation that converted to something more professional when he saw Thomas's face. "Come in," he said. Thomas laid out the situation at Kellen's kitchen table, while Kellen's wife poured coffee she had not been asked to pour and did not call attention to. Kellen read the filing. He read it the way lawyers read things slowly, with his expression giving away nothing, one hand flat on the table. When he finished, he looked up. "This is real," he said. "I know. It's going to take 6 to 8 weeks to resolve if it goes through the standard process. Possibly longer if Henderson has a judge he's comfortable with. Can it be beaten? Yes." Kellen set the papers down. "Morrison's ownership chain is clean. I've seen the deed history on that property going back to the original territorial grant. Henderson is making an argument that requires ignoring about 4 steps of well-documented legal title." He paused. "But he's betting that Morrison won't want the hassle and that the tenant won't have the resources to mount a defense." Thomas looked at him. "I'll cover the legal fees," Thomas said. Kellen looked at him. "That's a generous thing to say?" "It's not generosity." Kellen looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded once. "I'll need to contact Mrs. Morrison directly. She needs to be named in the response." "How fast can you file?" 48 hours. "File in 48 hours." Thomas stood. "Does Charlotte Bennett know about this?" Kellen asked. Thomas put on his hat. "She's going to," he said. He went directly to her shop. The morning rush on the main street meant he had to move through it rather than around it, and it was during this movement between the hardware store and the general store, and the 2 men having a discussion outside the barber's, that he heard his name from a direction he hadn't expected. "Walker." He turned. Henderson himself was standing at the edge of the boardwalk. He was a broad man, maybe 50, with the patience of someone who had made money by waiting. Thomas had met him twice before. Each time he'd had the impression of a man who had decided that what he wanted and what was right were the same thing, and had never been challenged on that equation hard enough to reconsider. "I hear you've been taking an interest in the Morrison property situation," Henderson said. "I'm aware of what you filed." Henderson's expression didn't change. "Legal process, nothing personal." "Filing a quiet title claim on a clean deed chain with the specific intent of forcing a tenant to abandon her lease is personal," Thomas said. "You just chose paperwork instead of showing up yourself." Henderson looked at him with the measured expression of a man calculating. "She's a dressmaker. In a building, I could turn into something that serves 3 times the people." He spread his hands slightly. "Town grows, Walker. Things change." "The town grows," Thomas said, "because people build things in it, including dressmakers who came out here and signed a lease in good faith and invested every dollar they had into a shop that supports 6 women in this county who buy fabric and pay fair prices." He took 1 step closer. "Henderson, I have spoken to Robert Kellen. He is filing a response in 48 hours on behalf of Morrison and Bennett both, and the deed chain on that property is going to embarrass your claim in open court in front of everyone in this county who's been wondering for years whether your land dealings are as clean as you say they are." The silence between them was very specific. Henderson's jaw tightened. "That's a threat," Henderson said. "That's a description," Thomas replied. "Of what happens next. You can reconsider or you can proceed, and we'll let the court decide whose paperwork is better." He left without waiting for an answer. He was halfway down the block before he realized his hands were shaking. Not from fear, from something else. Something that felt like fury but ran deeper than fury. A protective anger he hadn't felt in years, directed at someone who was trying to dismantle a thing that mattered. He hadn't let anything matter in 5 years. The shaking hands were evidence of what happened when you did. Charlotte did not take the news quietly. He told her at the back table in her shop with coffee she didn't touch, and she listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "He filed it 2 weeks ago," she said. "Yes." "And you found it this morning?" "Yes." "At the recorder's office." She looked up. "Which you've been checking since November." Thomas said nothing. "Thomas!" Her voice was complicated, not angry, not grateful exactly, something that held both of those and something heavier underneath. "You cannot keep doing this." He hadn't expected that. "Keep doing what?" standing between me and every threat before I even know the threat exists. She stood up, walked to the window, stood there with her back to him for a moment. I came here alone. I built this alone. I need to know I can keep building it. You can. With you handling things I don't know about. She turned around. I'm not angry at you for finding this. I'm grateful. But I need to be in the room, Thomas. When things concern my business, I need to be in the room. He sat with that. She was right. He had been protecting her the way he'd built things thoroughly from the outside, making sure the structure was sound before anyone moved in. But Charlotte wasn't a building. You're right, he said. She looked at him. I'm not used to... He stopped, started again. When I care about something, my instinct is to put myself between it and whatever's coming. I've done it alone for so long that I didn't think about how it would feel from your side. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Then she walked back to the table and sat down. You care about this, she said, not a question. Yes. About the shop. He looked at her. Among other things. A long pause. Then tell me next time, she said. Before you go to Kellen. Before you go to Henderson. Her voice softened slightly. We do it together. Or not at all. Together, Thomas said. The word sat between them differently than any word had sat between them before. Charlotte reached for her coffee. Kellen's good, she said. Henderson won't want it going to court. No, Thomas agreed. He won't. Then we wait. Then we wait. She looked at him over her coffee cup. Thank you, she said. Even for the parts I didn't ask you to do. You're welcome, he said. Even for the parts you didn't ask. Henderson withdrew the quiet title claim 11 days later. Kellen delivered the news to Charlotte and Thomas together at Charlotte's shop in the manner of a man who took professional satisfaction in the resolution. He was formal about it, but his eyes were pleased. Charlotte shook his hand. Thomas shook his hand. Kellen left. Charlotte let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for 11 days and sat down on the stool behind her counter and put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying, just releasing something that had been wound tight for too long. Thomas stood on his side of the counter. Then he walked around it. He sat on the stool next to hers and put his hand on her back and left it there, and she leaned sideways against his shoulder the way you lean against something you've decided you can trust. And they sat there for a while without saying anything. It was the closest they had been. It was also the most completely quiet Thomas Walker had felt in 5 years. Not the empty quiet of a man who had removed everything that could hurt him. The full quiet of a man who was sitting somewhere he wanted to be. He should have known then what was coming. He should have recognized that this was the moment, the warm, settled, certain moment that he always managed to ruin. Not deliberately. Thomas was not a man who destroyed things on purpose, but he was a man who, when something good arrived, looked at it long enough to believe it was real, and then panicked and made the worst decision available to him. It happened 3 weeks later. The letter from Marcus Hale arrived on a Thursday. Hale was a rancher in New Mexico Territory, wealthy, serious, with a construction project that needed a man of Thomas's specific skills. A full working compound main house, bunkhouses, storage, stable, fencing across 400 acres. The contract was for 8 months. The money was more than Thomas had earned in the previous 3 years combined. He read the letter twice. Then he sat at his kitchen table and did the thing he always did when something frightened him, which was to build an argument so airtight that the fear couldn't find a seam. Charlotte was young, 26. She had the shop secured now. Kellen had made sure the lease was unassailable. Morrison had extended it without condition. Henderson had gone quiet. She had the business she came here to build. She had the town's respect. She had everything she'd planned for before she ever arrived in Silver Creek. She did not need a man who woke up some nights in January still reaching for someone who had been gone for 5 years. She did not need someone whose first instinct, even now, even after everything was to put himself between her and danger rather than beside her as an equal. She needed someone lighter, someone who didn't carry so much. He wrote back to Hale that night. He accepted the contract. He told himself it was the right decision. But he carved something that same night, sitting at his workbench at 2 a.m, with his hands working while his brain ran circles around what he was about to do. His hands went to the wood, the way they always did, when he needed somewhere to put what he couldn't say. And by the time he stopped and looked at what he'd made, it was a flower. Small. Intricate. Every petal shaped with the patience of a man who needed to believe that something made carefully enough could survive what he was about to do. He held it in his palm. He thought about leaving it on her doorstep without a note. He told himself that was cowardice. Then he did it anyway. Because Thomas Walker, at 34 years old with a grief he'd carried for 5 years, and a fear he'd failed to put down in the weeks she'd given him the chance to, was not yet the man he needed to be. He knew it. Leaving was not the answer. But he left. He rode out of Silver Creek on a gray February morning, before the town was awake, with his bag packed and his tools loaded, and the contract in his coat pocket, and the memory of Charlotte leaning against his shoulder, sitting in the center of his chest, like a stone he had chosen to carry. He did not say goodbye, because he knew, if he saw her face, he would not be able to go, and he had not yet learned that staying was the braver choice. He would learn it, but not before he caused the one kind of pain he had spent 5 years trying never to cause again. Charlotte found the wooden flower at 7 a.m. She had come to open the shop early, she always did on Fridays, because the ranch women from the outer properties tended to come in on Friday mornings, and she liked to have everything ready, and it was sitting on the doorstep, small and precise, and carved with the kind of patience that had only one author in Silver Creek. She picked it up. She turned it over in her hands, and she understood immediately, completely, with the particular clarity of a woman who had been paying close attention for 4 months, exactly what it meant. She did not go looking for him. She already knew he was gone. She went inside, set the flower on the counter beside her reading glasses, and opened the shop. She greeted Mrs. Harmon when she came in. She measured fabric for the Colby order. She pinned a hem for the schoolteacher's daughter with steady hands and a level voice and the composed expression of a woman who had learned long before Silver Creek that the work was always there even when everything else wasn't. She was fine until Mrs. Patterson came in at noon. Mrs. Patterson took one look at Charlotte's face and said, "Oh, sweetheart," and Charlotte, who had not cried in front of anyone in longer than she could remember, had to excuse herself to the back room for 3 minutes. 3 minutes exactly. Then she came back out. Because the shop was open and the work was there, and Charlotte Bennett had not come 400 miles to fall apart over a man who didn't yet know how to stay. Frank Colby came to tell her the details 2 days later. He did it the way Frank did most things, directly, without preamble, with the expression of a man who thought honesty was more respectful than softening. He took a contract in New Mexico, Frank said. Hale Ranch. 8 months of construction work. Charlotte was behind her counter. She nodded. He left fast, Frank said. Didn't tell anyone. I found out from the livery man. I know, Charlotte said. Frank looked at her. Are you? I'm fine, Frank. Charlotte. I am angry, she said with perfect composure. And I am hurt. And I am going to stay open and run my business and not make it anyone else's problem. Frank was quiet for a moment. He's a fool, he said. He's afraid, Charlotte said. There's a difference. She straightened a bolt of fabric that didn't need straightening. Fear makes people do foolish things. That doesn't make them a fool. Frank looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been taught something he should have known. He doesn't deserve that kind of understanding, he said. No. Charlotte agreed. He doesn't. But I'm giving it anyway. She looked up. Because I know something about Thomas Walker that he doesn't know about himself yet. Frank waited. He came back from 5 years of grief, she said. He let someone in. He sat beside me in this shop and held my hand and said he was staying. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. A man who does that, who breaks through that much silence to say one honest thing, that man comes back. A long pause. You believe that, Frank said. I have to, Charlotte said. And the way she said it, not with certainty, but with the deliberate hard-won conviction of a woman who had decided what she was going to believe because the alternative was too costly, made Frank Colby go home and not say another word about it to anyone. February became March. The shop grew. This was the truth that sustained Charlotte through the weeks that were hard, which were most of them. The work grew and she grew with it. 3 new clients from the outlying ranches, a commission for 6 dresses for the Peterson wedding party, a request from the minister's wife for matching choir robes that turned into an 8-week project employing 2 of Charlotte's neighbors as seamstresses. She was building something. She had always been building something. She told herself that Thomas's leaving was not a demolition of what she was building. It was a reminder that she had never needed him for the foundation. She told herself this on the days it was true. On the days it wasn't, she worked later. The wooden flower stayed on the counter. She never moved it. Several customers asked about it. She said a friend had made it. She did not say more. Mrs. Patterson, who noticed everything and kept about half of it to herself, noticed that Charlotte touched it sometimes without knowing she was doing it, a quick brush of fingers on her way past the way you touch a thing you've decided not to put away. She mentioned it to Frank Colby. Frank said nothing. He had a letter he was composing in his head to an address in New Mexico territory that he was going to finish writing one of these days when he got angry enough. DM. In New Mexico, Thomas Walker was building. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. The Hale Ranch project was exactly the kind of work he understood, large, physical, demanding, with enough complexity to require his full attention from first light to last. Marcus Hale was a straightforward man who said what he wanted and paid what he promised and left Thomas alone to work, which was everything Thomas had told himself he needed. The first 2 weeks were almost a relief. The 3rd week was not. He started noticing it in small ways. He would finish a section of framing and turn to say something to someone who wasn't there. He would solve a structural problem during supper and have the thought of telling Charlotte about it arrive in his mind before he remembered. He would wake in the early morning, 4:30, the hour he'd always been awake, and lie in the silence of the bunkhouse and reach for the particular feeling of purpose he'd had in Silver Creek, the feeling of a life that was going somewhere, and find that it didn't travel. It had not packed itself up and come with him. It had stayed behind. He worked harder. He took on additional framing when one of the other workers fell sick. He stayed late redoing sections he was not satisfied with. He drove himself with the same focused intensity he'd used for 5 years to keep himself from feeling the particular silence of a life with nothing in its center. It worked less well than it used to, because now he knew what the alternative felt like. He knew what it felt like to have someone sit on a stool in his workshop and ask him about the wood. He knew what it felt like to have a reason to come in from the cold in the evenings. He knew what Charlotte's hand felt like in his, and what her voice sounded like when it was saying something real, something that landed in him and stayed. He had given all of that up. He had given it up because he was convinced, in the way he'd been convinced of several things that turned out to be wrong, that leaving was a form of protection. By week 5, he was no longer convinced. By week 6, he was having arguments with himself at the workbench that he was losing decisively. Ken. The letter arrived on a Tuesday evening. He almost missed it. Hale's foreman distributed correspondence at the end of the workday, and Thomas had been at the far end of the south fencing and came back late. The letter was sitting on his bunk when he got in. The handwriting on the outside was not Charlotte's. It was Frank Colby's. Thomas sat down on the bunk and opened it. Frank Colby's letters, it turned out, were exactly like Frank Colby's conversation, direct, plain, without performance. Thomas, I'm writing this because someone needs to, and I've decided it's me. Charlotte Bennett is fine. The shop is growing. She hasn't said a word against you to anyone in this town, which you don't deserve, and which tells you more about her character than I could in 10 pages. She has the wooden flower you left on her doorstep on the counter of her shop, and she touches it sometimes when she thinks no one is watching. I've been in Silver Creek for 22 years. I've watched a lot of people come through and a lot of people leave, and a lot of people make the specific kind of mistake that they spend the rest of their life trying to walk back from. You're making that mistake right now. I'm not going to tell you what to do. But I'm going to tell you that what you left behind is the real thing, and the real thing doesn't wait forever. Frank. Thomas read it once. Then he put it down on the bunk and sat with his hands on his knees, and the letter's words moving through him like water, moving through a cracked wall, finding every gap, filling every space he'd thought he'd sealed. She touches it sometimes when she thinks no one is watching. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He sat like that for a long time. Then he stood up. He didn't make a list. He didn't compose an argument. He didn't build a case for or against the way he'd been doing for weeks. He just knew. The same way he knew when a structure was sound or when it wasn't. The same way he knew when a piece of wood had the right grain or when it would split under pressure. A bone-deep certainty that bypassed the part of him that was good at finding reasons to doubt. He went to find Marcus Hale. Hale was in the main house at the long table with his account books, which was where Hale spent his evenings. He looked up when Thomas came in, read his face, and closed the account book. "Sit down," Hale said. Thomas sat. "I need to leave the contract," Thomas said. Hale was quiet for a moment. "How much of the work is finished?" "The main house framing is complete. The bunkhouse foundations are poured and the walls are up. The stable is 3/4 done." Thomas leaned forward. "I can find you a man from Albuquerque who can finish the rest to the same standard. I know him personally. He's as good as me on the timber work and better on the stone." Hale looked at him. "This is about a woman." It was not a question. "Yes," Thomas said. Hale was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, "My wife followed me to 4 different territories before I got smart enough to stop moving." He opened his account book again. "I'll need the contact information for the man in Albuquerque before you go." Thomas exhaled. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," Hale said. "Get moving." Yaman. He rode hard. He was not a man who rode hard without reason, but he had reason now, and the days felt different when they were moving toward something rather than away. He stopped to sleep when the horse needed it and moved again before first light, and on the morning of the 3rd day, he came down from the high country into the familiar geography of the Colorado Territory, and felt something shift in his chest that he recognized dimly as relief. He came into Silver Creek at mid-morning. The town was in its ordinary Tuesday motion commerce conversation. The blacksmith the children released from the schoolhouse for morning recess running past him in a current of noise. He rode to the livery, left his horse, and walked directly to Charlotte's shop. He did not stop to think about what he was going to say. He had thought about it for 3 weeks on the road from New Mexico, and the thinking had not produced anything better than the truth. The door to the shop opened cleanly on its repaired hinges. Charlotte was behind the counter. She looked up from her work, and the expression on her face in the first second, before she arranged it, before she decided what to show him, was something Thomas knew he would carry for the rest of his life. Not anger, though anger was in there. Not relief, though that was there too. Something more complicated than either. Something that looked like a woman who had prepared herself for the possibility that he was not coming back and was now confronted with the evidence that he had and was not yet sure what to do with that. He took his hat off. The shop was empty. Just the 2 of them and the wooden flower on the counter between them. "I left because I was afraid," he said. He had said this sentence in his head 100 times, and it came out plainly now without decoration. "I convinced myself it was for your benefit, that you'd be better without someone carrying what I carry." He stopped. "I was wrong. I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting the part of me that was afraid to need someone again." Charlotte said nothing. Her hands were flat on the counter. "I'm not going to tell you that walking out without a word was anything other than cowardice," Thomas continued. "Because it was. I knew if I saw your face I wouldn't go, and I went anyway." His voice stayed even, but something underneath it was not. That is the truth, and I won't dress it up. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful, controlled. The voice of a woman who had been running on composure for 3 weeks and was not going to stop now just because he had come back. You left a wooden flower on my doorstep, she said. With no note. Yes. Do you know how many possible meanings a wooden flower with no note has? I imagine I gave you the worst possible morning of several you've had recently. You did. A pause. Mrs. Patterson cried. I had to comfort her, which is not how that's supposed to work. Something moved through Thomas's chest that was not quite grief and not quite the other thing, but close to both. Charlotte. Don't. She held up one hand. I'm not finished. He stopped. She came around the counter. Not toward him, she stopped a few feet away, far enough that this was still a conversation, and not anything else yet. I told Frank Colby you would come back, she said. I told him I believed it, and I meant it, but I also spent 3 weeks not being certain of it, and those were 3 very long weeks, Thomas. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. I am not going to pretend I wasn't hurt. I'm not going to tell you it was fine. It was not fine. I know, and I need to know. She stopped. Her voice was doing the thing now where it was working to stay level and not entirely succeeding. I need to know that if something frightens you, if something feels too large, or too close, or too real, you talk to me. Before you pack a bag. Before you find a contract in New Mexico. Before you carve something beautiful and leave it without a word. She stepped closer. Can you do that? Thomas looked at her. He thought about 5 years of solitude. He thought about every conversation he'd ended before it got honest, every distance he'd maintained, every feeling he'd filed under manageable and carried alone. He thought about lying awake at 4 a.m. in a New Mexico bunkhouse, knowing with bone-deep certainty that he had made the worst available decision. Yes, he said. I can do that. You're sure? I'm sure. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed the remaining distance between them and put both hands flat against his chest, not holding on, just contact, the way you put your hands on a wall to feel whether it's solid. Don't do it again, she said quietly. I won't. I mean it. I know you do. Her hands stayed where they were. His came up and covered them. They stood like that for a long moment. I missed your workshop, she said, and her voice had shifted into something smaller and more honest. I missed you sitting on that stool, he said. She looked up at him, and Thomas Walker, who had spent 5 years making sure nothing could touch him, looked at this woman who had refused every exit he'd built, who had kept a wooden flower on her counter and touched it when she thought no one was watching, who had said, I'm not asking you not to be afraid. I'm asking you to be afraid and stay, and felt something that he had convinced himself was gone forever. Not the same as what he'd had before, different, deeper, built on harder ground. He leaned down and touched his forehead to hers. I'm sorry, he said, quietly, just the two of them. I know, she said. Don't make me forgive you twice. He almost smiled. I won't. They stayed close for a moment longer. Then Charlotte stepped back, not away, just back, putting breath between them, the way you open a window to let fresh air into a room that's been shut too long. Are you staying? She asked. Thomas looked at her. Yes, he said. I'm staying. And this time it was not the bravest thing he had ever done. This time it was simply the obvious one. Because the man who had spent 5 years afraid of wanting something had finally learned the one thing all that solitude could never teach him. That the only thing more terrifying than needing someone was the particular emptiness of a life spent making sure you never did. The town noticed he was back before noon. Frank Colby shook his hand twice and didn't let Thomas tell him to stop. Mrs. Patterson appeared at Charlotte's shop door with a cake she claimed she had made for an entirely unrelated reason. The Harmon boys found excuses to walk past the shop 3 times. Silver Creek was a small town. It did not require announcements. But that evening, sitting in the back of Charlotte's shop with coffee and the particular quality of quiet that belongs to two people who have come through something, Thomas said, the thing he had been working toward for months. "I want to tell you something," he said. Charlotte looked up from her ledger. "I spent 5 years thinking that if I stopped moving, if I let myself stay anywhere long enough to want it, I would lose it the way I lost Anna." He kept his hands around his coffee cup. "And I convinced myself that protecting myself from loss was the same as wisdom. That a man who doesn't reach for things can't be hurt by not having them." Charlotte was quiet. "But here's what I know now," he said. "A man who doesn't reach for things doesn't have anything either, and having nothing doesn't feel safe." He looked at her directly. "It feels exactly like what it is." "What is it?" she said quietly. "A waste," he said, "of whatever time you're given." Charlotte closed her ledger. "That's the most you've said to me at once," she said. "Since the night you told me about the mare at Kearney Ranch." He thought about that first time she'd said those words to him months ago, in the early days, when he was only beginning to understand what she was. "I used to talk more," he said. She smiled, slowly. "The real one." "I know," she said. "I've been waiting." And outside Silver Creek, moved through its ordinary evening, and inside the shop, the coffee went cold while they talked, and Thomas Walker, who had ridden 3 weeks back from the worst decision he'd ever made, sat with the woman who had kept his wooden flower on her counter and felt for the first time in 5 years that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The coffee went cold, and neither of them moved to warm it. That was the thing about the evenings that followed Thomas's return. They had a different quality from the evenings before he left. Before, there had always been something held back. A door in the room that neither of them fully opened. The conversation went deep, and then it went to the edge of something, and then one of them, usually Thomas, sometimes Charlotte, in her own way, pulled it back to safer ground. That door was gone now. Not because everything was settled. Not because the complicated parts of Thomas Walker had resolved themselves during 3 weeks on the road from New Mexico, but because the specific fear that had kept him at a managed distance, the fear that wanting something meant losing it, and that losing it would finish him, had been tested, and the test had not gone the way he expected. He had left. He had lost 3 weeks of what they were building, and he had survived it. More than survived, he had ridden back. He had stood in front of her and said the honest thing, and she was still here. Ledger closed, coffee. Cold, listening to him talk about the mare at Kearney Ranch and a life spent mistaking solitude for strength. The fear wasn't gone, but it had lost its authority. He came by the shop the next morning with his tools and fixed 3 things she hadn't asked him to fix, and 1 thing she hadn't noticed needed fixing. She watched him work with the expression she'd developed over the winter. Not quite a smile, not quite satisfaction, something that combined both into something more specific than either. "You know," she said, "I was managing perfectly well without you for 3 weeks. I know you were. The shop didn't fall apart. I didn't think it would. Henderson didn't come back. He won't." She handed him a cup of coffee. "Then what are you fixing?" Thomas looked at the hinge in his hand. "Things that are going to be a problem in 6 months if no one addresses them now." Charlotte leaned against the counter. "That's a metaphor, isn't it?" He looked at her. "About us," she said. "You're telling me you're going to address things before they become problems, rather than leaving them until they require a man to ride back from New Mexico." He set the hinge down. "I was thinking about the door frame." "Thomas." "But yes," he said. It was also a metaphor. She smiled, the real one, the one that happened before she decided whether to let it, and turned back to her work, and Thomas picked up his tools again, and the shop was quiet, in the good way, the way that meant 2 people were comfortable enough not to fill it. Oh, here. 2 weeks after Thomas came back, he asked her something at the end of an evening. They were at his workshop. She was on her stool. He had been working on a chair commission and had stopped when the light got bad, and now they were at the point in the evening where neither of them was ready to say it was time to go. "Tell me what you want," he said. "Not from the shop, not from Silver Creek." He looked at her directly. "What do you actually want for your life?" Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "You asked me this before," she said. "Months ago." "I know. You said you were getting there." He paused. "I want to know if the answer has changed." She looked at him for a long moment. "I want the shop to be successful enough that I can employ 4 women full-time and pay them properly," she said. "I want to stop renting and own the building, eventually buy it from Morrison, if she'll sell or find land and build." She paused. "I want to travel once to see the Pacific coast because I've been moving toward practical things for so long that I want to know what it feels like to do something with no purpose except that it's beautiful." Thomas listened. "And I want—" She stopped. "Say it," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I want someone beside me who isn't going anywhere." A pause. "Not because he has to stay. Because he wants to." The workshop was quiet. "I want that too," Thomas said. Charlotte looked at him. "The someone beside me part," he said. "Not the Pacific coast, although I wouldn't rule it out." Something moved across her face, something that started as the restrained smile and became something less restrained. And then she laughed, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind that changed the whole shape of a room. Thomas felt it in his chest. He was going to feel that laugh for the rest of his life. He already knew it. March moved into April. Thomas was back to the Harmon property, back to the Colby fence line, back to the ordinary work of Silver Creek that had structured his days for years. Except now the days had a different architecture. They began the same early cold physical, but they moved towards something in the evenings, and that forward motion gave them a shape they hadn't had before. He was building something for himself too, not for a client, not for wages. On the land at the edge of his property, 3 acres he owned outright, had owned since his second year in Silver Creek, and never developed because there was no one to develop it for, he started clearing and leveling. Early mornings before the paid work. Weekend hours. The methodical, patient labor of a man who was building toward something he now believed he was allowed to have. He didn't tell Charlotte, not yet. Frank Colby found out because Frank Colby found out everything that happened within 2 miles of his ranch. "You're building on the Walker land," Frank said one afternoon. "I'm clearing it," Thomas said. "What for?" Thomas looked at him. Frank's face went through several expressions in quick succession. "Thomas Walker," he said with the gravity of a man who had been waiting a long time to say something like this. "If you don't ask that woman to marry you before summer—" "I know what I'm doing, Frank." "Do you have a ring?" Thomas was quiet. "I can ask Margaret if she knows anyone." "Frank, I'm just offering resources." "I don't need resources," Thomas said. "I need you to stop talking about this." Frank stopped talking about it. But he smiled for the rest of the afternoon, which was almost worse. The first week of April brought something nobody had expected. A letter arrived at Charlotte's shop from St. Louis, and by the look on her face when Thomas came by that evening, it was not a simple letter. She handed it to him without explanation. He read it. It was from a woman named Eleanor Briggs, the owner of the Morrison dressmaking shop in St. Louis, the one Charlotte had worked in for 6 years, the one where she had learned her trade and saved every dollar and planned her escape to somewhere she could build her own thing. Eleanor Briggs was writing to offer Charlotte a position. Not a seamstress position, a partnership. The shop was expanding. Eleanor wanted someone she trusted to run the new second location on the west side of the city. The letter was generous, specific. The kind of offer that came from someone who knew exactly what they were asking and what it was worth. Thomas read it twice, then he set it on the table. Charlotte was watching him. "When did it arrive?" he said. "This morning." "Have you written back?" "Not yet." She kept watching him. "I wanted to talk to you first. Something about that." The simple fact of it that her first instinct was to talk to him before she decided landed in Thomas with a weight he hadn't prepared for. "This is a real offer," he said. "I know. It's St. Louis, a partnership. That's—" He stopped. "That's everything you were working toward before you came here." "It's what I was working toward," Charlotte said carefully. "Not what I'm working toward now." Thomas looked at her. "The shop here is mine," she said. "I built it. My name is on the lease. Those 6 women who work with me now, I know their children's names and their rent situations and what they need from me as an employer. Eleanor's offer is generous, but it's her vision, her building her city." She paused. "I spent 6 years in her city helping someone else build something. I came here to build my own." "Charlotte." He paused. "Don't decide this based on me." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not deciding based on you. I'm deciding based on what I want." Another pause. "I want you to know that I want to stay here. I'm telling you because it's honest and because you deserve to know I'm choosing this." Her voice was even. "But this is my choice, not yours." Thomas looked at the letter on the table, then at her. "Write back and tell her no," he said. Charlotte looked at him. "Tell her you have something of your own," he said. "That you appreciate the offer and you're not available." She picked up the letter. "All right," she said. And there was something in those 2 words, not relief, not triumph, but a simple settled certainty that told Thomas this had already been decided before he read a single line of the letter. She had wanted him to know she was choosing. He understood that now. And he understood what it cost to choose to take a real, generous, well-constructed exit and set it down anyway. He knew that cost better than almost anyone. That night he went back to the Walkerland and worked until it was too dark to see. The second twist arrived the following week, and this one Thomas had not seen coming. He was at the county recorder's office, habit still from the fall, when the clerk mentioned, with the offhand quality of someone conveying information they assumed you already had, that the Morrison property had changed hands. Thomas stopped. "What do you mean changed hands?" The clerk checked his records. "Deed transfer recorded 3 days ago. Widow Morrison sold the property." He looked up. "To a buyer in Denver. Real estate firm. Morrison Properties, LLC." Thomas felt something cold move through him. "Henderson." "No, not Henderson." The clerk read more carefully. "Out-of-state buyer. Denver-based. No connection to Henderson's previous filings on the record." "What does the LLC hold?" "Just acquired 3 other properties on that block." The clerk looked at him. "They're assembling something, but I can't tell you what yet." Thomas left the office and went directly to Robert Kellen. Kellen was in his office when Thomas arrived, and the expression on Thomas's face had Kellen closing his other work without being asked. Thomas told him. Kellen listened. Kellen sent for the deed transfer records immediately and had them in hand within the hour, and he read through them with the focused silence of a man who was building something in his head as he read. When he finished, he set the papers down. "The lease," Kellen said, "is still valid." "You're certain?" "The property transferred to a new owner. The lease is a binding agreement that transfers with the property. Morrison can sell to whoever she wants. She can't sell the building out from under a valid lease agreement." Kellen looked at him. "Charlotte is protected. The 2-year lease is still in effect." Thomas exhaled. "But," Kellen said. Thomas waited. "After the lease period ends, the new owner has no obligation to renew." Kellen folded his hands. "And given that someone is assembling property on that block, I'd say the renewal is unlikely." Thomas was quiet. "How long until the lease expires?" 14 months. 14 months. Not an emergency, not immediate, but also not distant enough to ignore. What are Charlotte's options? Kellen leaned back. She can negotiate with the new owner for a renewal, but given the assembly pattern, I wouldn't count on it. She can look for alternative property, or," he paused, "she can pursue purchase of a different building entirely, build her own foundation, so to speak." Thomas stood. "Thank you," he said. He went to tell Charlotte. Tag. She took it differently than he expected. He had braced for the reaction that fear produces, the tightened jaw, the controlled breathing, the composed exterior over a churning interior he'd seen in November when the lawyer came with papers. He had come prepared to be the steady one this time, to stay in the room to do it together the way they had agreed. But Charlotte listened to the whole situation, asked 2 precise questions, and then was quiet for exactly 30 seconds. Then she said, "I've been looking at the Edmonds building." Thomas blinked. "The one on Cartwright Street," she said. "It's been empty for 8 months. The Edmonds family moved to California, and they're asking a fair price because they want a clean sale." She was watching him. "I've been running the numbers for 6 weeks." 6 weeks, Thomas said. "I started looking after Eleanor Briggs wrote to me," Charlotte said, "because her letter reminded me that the only real security is what you own outright. A lease is someone else's permission. I don't want to keep asking permission." Thomas looked at her. "You've been planning this," he said. "I've been preparing," she said. "There's a difference." The ghost of a smile. "You taught me that. You build things so they last. I've been trying to learn to do the same." He looked at this woman who had taken a threat he brought her and folded it into a plan she'd already half made, who had turned an offer from St. Louis into a confirmation of what she was choosing, who had kept a wooden flower on her counter for 3 weeks while he was in New Mexico, and touched it without knowing she was being watched, and felt something so large and certain move through him that he knew he could not wait any longer. He had been waiting for the right moment. He understood now that he had been waiting for a courage he already had. "Charlotte," he said. Something in his voice shifted the room. She looked at him with full attention. He reached into his coat pocket. He had been carrying it for 10 days. He had not gone to a jeweler, not because he couldn't afford to, but because buying something that came from a case felt wrong, felt like someone else's idea of what this should look like. Instead, he had gone to a silversmith in the next county, a man named Aldrich, who worked with the patience of someone for whom every piece was a single piece. And he had described what he wanted, and Aldrich had made it. A band of silver with a single stone not large, not performing wealth, and a setting that was clean and handmade and meant to last. He set it on the counter between them. Charlotte went completely still. "I am not going to make you a speech," Thomas said. "You know me well enough by now to know that a speech would mean I was performing something rather than saying it." He paused. "So, I'm just going to say it." She was looking at the ring, then at him. "I love you," he said. The words came out plainly without hesitation, and that plainness was the most honest thing about them. "I have loved you since the Harvest Festival, and probably before that, and I have spent months finding ways not to say it because I thought I needed to protect myself from what it meant. And I was wrong." He stopped. "Charlotte, I want to build a house on the Walker land with a porch wide enough to be worth sitting on, and big windows, and a garden that serves no practical purpose. I want to buy you the Edmonds building on Cartwright Street because you deserve to own what you build. I want to be beside you, not in front of you, not managing things from a distance beside you." He met her eyes. "Will you marry me?" The shop was very quiet. Charlotte looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she looked at him. And her eyes were bright. Not crying, not exactly, but close enough that the difference was technical. And she said with the particular composure of a woman who had been holding a very large feeling in place for a very long time, and was now deciding to put it down. "Thomas Walker," she said. "I have been waiting for you to say that since approximately October." He felt something loosen in his chest that had been held tight since January. "Is that a yes?" he said. "It's a yes," she said. "It's also a commentary on your timing." He picked up the ring. She held out her hand. He put it on. It fit. Of course it fit. He had been paying attention. They told Frank Colby first because Frank had earned it. Frank shook Thomas's hand 3 times, and then in what Thomas suspected was a first in the man's adult life, pulled him into a brief and fierce embrace that Thomas endured with the stoic acceptance of a man who understood that some things were not avoidable. Mrs. Patterson cried, genuinely, thoroughly, with the complete commitment of a woman who had been waiting for this specific occasion since October and was determined to honor it properly. The rest of Silver Creek found out the way Silver Creek always found out things, through the distributed, efficient network of a small community that had been watching 2 people circle each other since autumn and had formed collective opinions. The general response was satisfaction. The kind of satisfaction that comes not from surprise, but from recognition, from watching something arrive that was always supposed to arrive, that had taken longer than it needed to, because the people involved were human and complicated and afraid, but that had come in the end because it was real. Real things came in the end. That was what Thomas was learning. The Edmonds building on Cartwright Street was purchased in May. Charlotte negotiated the price herself, with Kellen reviewing the paperwork, and Thomas sitting in the room at her specific request not to speak, just to be there, which was something he had finally learned to do without needing to manage the outcome. When the deed transferred into Charlotte Bennett's name, she held the paper for a moment with the look of someone who has been working toward a single point for so long that arriving at it produces something more complex than simple happiness. Thomas watched her. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Terrifying," she said. "And exactly right." He understood that combination better than almost anything else he knew. The building needed work, significant work, as empty buildings always did. Thomas drew the plans himself, talked Charlotte through each decision, and modified them 3 times when she had better ideas, which she frequently did. They worked on it together in the evenings in the weeks before the wedding, with the particular productive rhythm of 2 people who had stopped pretending their instincts didn't overlap. He built the display cases to the specifications she gave him. She redesigned the front entrance in a way he wouldn't have thought of, and that was better. He told her it was better. She looked at him with an expression that suggested she had not expected that and was pleased by it. "You could have argued," she said. "You were right," he said simply. Charlotte looked at him for a moment. "You've changed," she said. "I've been paying attention," he said. "There's a difference." She smiled. The real one. They married on the last Saturday of May. It was not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted large. They wanted real, which was something different. Robert Kellen stood with Thomas. Charlotte's neighbor, Sarah Walsh, who had become a genuine friend over the winter, stood with Charlotte. Frank Colby sat in the front row with his wife and produced at the exact moment the minister pronounced them married an expression of such complete and undisguised satisfaction that Thomas filed it away as something he would hold against Frank for years and secretly be grateful for. Mrs. Patterson cried again. This time, nobody had to comfort her. Charlotte wore a dress she had made herself. Of course, she had ivory silk with simple, clean lines, nothing excessive. The dress of a woman who understood that elegance and simplicity were not in opposition. She had worked on it in the evenings after Thomas left, which meant she had started it before he asked her, which meant she had known. Thomas thought about that standing at the front of the church. She had known. She had kept the faith of it while he was still finding his way to asking. He was going to spend the rest of his life being worthy of that particular kind of patience. When she came through the door and the room settled into the specific quiet that greets the arrival of something true, Thomas looked at her, and the thought that moved through him was not something elaborate. It was simply, there she is. The way you think it about something you have been trying to find your way back to for a very long time. The summer that followed was the fullest of Thomas's adult life. The house on the Walker land went up through June and July, built by Thomas's hands with help from Frank Colby, the Harmon boys, and a rotating assembly of Silver Creek men who showed up unrequested on Saturday mornings with tools and the cheerful stubbornness of a community that had decided this particular house was going to stand. Thomas fed them and worked beside them and accepted the help without argument, which was new, which was something he had been practicing. He built the porch wide, wider than necessary, wide enough that 2 chairs could sit side by side with room for a small table and a coffee cup, and the particular luxury of an evening with nothing required of it. He built the windows large. He did not build the garden. He prepared the ground for it, turned the soil laid out, the bed dimensions, and then handed Charlotte a packet of seeds and said it was hers to make. She planted things he didn't know the names of. He didn't ask. He watched them come up through August with the attention of a man who has decided that some things are improved by not understanding everything about them, that some things you simply trust and watch and let become what they're going to become. In September, the thing happened that Thomas had not prepared for. He was at his workshop. Still kept it, still worked it because the work was part of who he was, and Charlotte had never once suggested otherwise when he found the box. He had not looked for it. He had simply moved a cabinet that had been against the back wall since he first rented the space, and behind it was the old wooden box that had been there since the first year in Silver Creek. The box he had brought with him from the place he'd been before. The box with Anna in it. He sat down on the floor with his back against the cabinet and held it in his hands for a long time. He had not opened it in 5 years. He opened it now. Inside a small portrait, a proper one done by a traveling artist in the first year, the kind of portrait that cost more than a ranch hand's week of wages, and that Thomas had saved for over 3 months because he wanted something real of her. A dried flower, not a carved one, a real one, the first flower he had ever given her, a small yellow thing from a field outside town. 2 letters she had written him when he was working a distant job, before they had learned how to be in the same place regularly. A small carved horse he had made for her, his first attempt at carving rough and imprecise, in a way that made him look at it now with affection for the man he had been at 28. He looked at each thing. He was still sitting there an hour later when Charlotte came in. She saw him on the floor. She saw the box. She said nothing for a moment. Then she sat down beside him on the floor, her shoulder against his, and looked at what he was holding. "That's her," she said quietly, looking at the portrait. "Yes." Charlotte looked for a long time. "She has kind eyes," she said. Thomas looked at the portrait. He had not looked at it in 5 years, and the face in it was both exactly as he remembered and slightly different from memory, the way all preserved things diverge gently from the version carried inside. "She did," he said. Charlotte put her hand over his on the box. They sat together on the floor of the workshop while September went on outside, and Thomas felt something that he had not expected to feel, not grief, or not only grief, but something alongside it that was closer to peace. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that holding on to her memory was a way of honoring her, and then I thought that letting anyone in was a betrayal." He paused. Both of those were wrong. Charlotte waited. "She would have wanted me to be here," he said, "doing exactly this, building something, having someone to build it with." He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 5 years thinking I was honoring her by keeping everything empty. And what I was actually doing—" "You were surviving," Charlotte said, quietly, without judgment. "And then you stopped surviving and started living. That's not a betrayal. That's the whole point." He looked at her, her face in profile, her hand over his, her shoulder against his in the afternoon light. "Yes," he said. He closed the box. He did not put it back behind the cabinet. He set it on the workbench where he could see it, where it was not hidden and not displayed, but simply present, part of the full history of who Thomas Walker was, neither erased nor held in place of what was living. Charlotte watched him do it. She did not say anything, but she squeezed his hand once briefly, the way you acknowledge something that doesn't need words. October came. The first anniversary of the Harvest Festival arrived on a Saturday, and Charlotte pointed it out over breakfast with the mild satisfaction of someone who enjoys marking things. "1 year ago today," she said, "you told me I was going to break a lot of hearts." Thomas drank his coffee. "I remember," he said. "You were wrong, by the way." He looked at her. "I didn't break anyone's hearts," she said. "I only ever wanted the one." A pause. "And I didn't break that either." Thomas set down his cup. "No," he said. "You didn't." Charlotte looked at him across the breakfast table in the house he had built on the land that was theirs, with the garden outside she had planted, and the shop on Cartwright Street that had her name above the door, and the wide porch where they sat most evenings, until the cold drove them in, and she said with the directness she had never once stopped applying to him, "Are you happy?" He thought about the question. He thought about 5 years of empty mornings and managed distances and a life constructed to be survivable. He thought about the Harvest Festival and the wooden flower and 3 weeks in New Mexico and coming back. He thought about the box on the workbench and the garden he hadn't planted and the porch and the windows and Frank Colby shaking his hand 3 times. "Yes," Thomas Walker said, without hesitation, without qualification. "I am happy." Charlotte smiled. The real one. The one that happened before she decided whether to let it, which she always let now, which she had stopped guarding around him somewhere in the long middle of everything they had come through together. "Good," she said simply. And outside Silver Creek moved into its second October, and the garden Charlotte planted showed the first rust-colored edge of autumn, and the porch sat wide and empty and waiting for the evening. And in the workshop at the edge of the property, a wooden flower stood on the workbench beside an old box and a new set of tools that belonged to a man who had finally, after 5 years and 400 miles, and every hard conversation in between, learned the one thing all his solitude had never been able to teach him, that a heart broken by love is not a heart that should stop. It is a heart that has already proven it knows how to feel the real thing. And the cowboy who had spent 5 years keeping his locked away discovered in the end that the woman who whispered, "I only want to mend yours," had not been promising to fix what was broken. She had been showing him with patience and honesty, and a wooden flower kept on a counter for 3 weeks without a word of complaint that it never needed fixing. It only needed someone willing to stay beside it until it remembered how to beat. And it did. It remembered. And it never forgot again.